So there we are. It says part 4, and indeed it is part 4, but I did say that the general presentation of this Mangalore problem would be in 3 parts. A, what we might know now. We know this is a man in the street. B, what people of the time probably said and chatted as they wondered about what was going on and observed what was going on. And 3, the larger story that adds rather more to what we know through the discovery not very long ago of material in the Lands Department files, which had lain hidden there for 150 years. But before I begin, let me just remind you that in this period we're talking about, there was, if you like, a struggle between Mangalore and Charleville. Which one of them was going to end up on top? Which one of them was going to become the capital of the Warrego? And so the struggle went on almost from the time people knew about Charleville, knew that it existed or was to exist as a town, through until, I think, yes, about 1869 and then 1870 with the aborted, or not aborted, but with the unsuccessful land sale of those 143 or 146, whatever it may have been, lots in Mangalore, none of which sold, that the matter really came to an end. But it's in that period, of course, that in the background, you've got another struggle going on, not a struggle between them, well, in a sense, it was indeed a struggle between the two towns, but there was a struggle going on between Tully and Gregory. Gregory was a Surveyor General, well-regarded man, regarded well, in a sense, for his knowledge. He had an encyclopedic knowledge. He was very much a sort of Renaissance man, so to speak, from what one can tell from the comments that are made about him. He appeared sometimes not to be the greatest administrator, but he also appeared to be sometimes not the greatest administrator because he felt that he had to be fairly sparing in the information that he released, and it had to be extracted from him as a dentist might a difficult tooth. But that may well have been related to the other part of the struggle, and the other part of the struggle, of course, was Tully. Tully arrived in Brisbane in 1863 and was clearly destined for the top. Somebody loved Tully from on high. And they continued to love Tully throughout his career. His career was promoted at every point, and as it seems to me as I read the documents, behind it all and his great protector was none other than McIlwraith, sometimes the Minister for Mines and Lands, the profitable portfolios, of course, and sometimes Premier. And on each occasion when Tully moved up, well, guess who was there looking after him? In fact, the most brazen of them, as I recall, let's see if I can find that. Yes, here we are. You remember I mentioned in one of these episodes that Lamb, the Chief Commissioner for Crown Lands, had a bit of a breakdown and resigned. Several days later, he wanted to say, hey, forget about that. But no way. McAllister wanted Tully in the job of Chief Commissioner for Crown Lands. Well, I dare say that the Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands made quite a few decisions that McAllister may have found interesting or maybe even profitable. I don't really know. But McAllister was determined to get his man into the top job. And of course he was also determined to get his man as high as he possibly could. And so the most brazen one was the one on, on the 9th of August of 1866, McAllister became the Premier. And on the 16th of August 1866, Tully became not only Chief Commissioner for Crown Lands, that is, after just 3 years in the colony, Not only that, he became the Under-Secretary for the Department of Lands. In other words, in charge of the general administration of the department in which Gregory, as Surveyor General, worked. There was a struggle between the two of them because people like Tully, they don't aim for midway. They don't aim just for Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands. Tully wanted to be the top dog all round, and it took him until 1875 to oust Gregory and to take over the position of Surveyor General. And we see that on the 8th of January 1874, McAllister had another stint as Premier. And it was in that period, and on the 12th of March 1875, Tully became the Surveyor General. So you've got these two at work. Now remember, Gregory wouldn't really have known very much about Tully when he arrived. No doubt his entry into the Queensland service was facilitated by McAllister. Now I don't know that for sure, but I'm just supposing that from the documents that I see. There's no way that Tully would have arrived as a sort of a surveyor for hire. He wouldn't have been leaving the comfort of the Lord homes in Tasmania and Sydney for the chances of life in Queensland. You may be sure that when he arrived at Luggage Point or whatever it may have been in Brisbane, I think it was about October of 1863, McAllister was there to meet him, or a trap sent especially by McAllister swept him into the city and to whatever comfortable lodgings or digs may have been available to him. So he was there, but aiming up. He was a troublemaker, and of course he began trouble for Gregory, but Gregory really didn't know too much about him. Gregory would have seen his glowing reference from the Surveyor General of Tasmania, Calder. Oh, it said he was wonderful. But of course, as I say, you may be sure that Calder was a member of the Tasmanian Club. Very, very, like the Warrego Club. Of 1943, I'm sure that the Warrego Club these days is a much more egalitarian setup. And I'm sure that those of us from Lower King Street who wished to enter would have been, royally welcome. But enough of that. We won't say any more. But Tully, of course, would have been uncaring about his membership of the Tasmanian Club, although if he had known quite the relationship between him and McAllister, he may have been a little more concerned. But nevertheless, Tully would have been concerned about his skill as a surveyor. Well, Calder from Tasmania said he was wonderful, absolutely wonderful, glowing. But Gregory would not have been able to judge Tully's capacity as a surveyor from his work in Rockingham Bay, because after all, it was the group of settlers and the other people who went with them who chose the site for what became Cardwell. And the site having been chosen by others, Tully's job was simply to sort of mark out its boundaries and to delineate a number of allotments of the choice, if you like, of the settlers who went up with that particular party. So that really told Gregory nothing about Tully's capacity. The only piece of surveying that Gregory would have had available to him, upon which he may have judged Tully's capacity, was Tully's foray into the Warrego, where he went off, and the task was to find a site, survey a site, which would be the capital of the Warrego. And so Tully went, he surveyed this site that is now Charleville, and returned. Well, it was on that basis that Gregory would have made his judgment about Tully's capacity. Well, Gregory didn't actually write what he thought. He hinted at what he thought. But certainly other people maybe less qualified than Gregory, had plenty to say. Ha ha ha! They didn't think much of it. And when you have a look at it now and you think, well, the choices that were available to Tully, and that's what he chose, perhaps Gregory didn't form from that the greatest opinion of Tully. But nevertheless, whether Gregory thought Tully as a surveyor was, hot stuff or not, it made no great difference, because lo and behold, it had been determined that in December of 1864, Tully would become the Deputy Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands. Not bad for a new boy. When there were plenty of surveyors around, with good reputations, who'd been in the employ of the department for quite some time. Oh, great numbers. But the man for the job was none other than William Alcock Tully. Well, I don't think Gregory would have been very impressed. And so that struggle went on and went on and went on. And if you were to believe the letter that I'll refer to shortly by Carl Churton, he of the pen, who wrote many letters, mainly to the Brisbane Courier, but not only to the Brisbane Courier, according to, if you believe what Churton wrote, Tully was destined to greatness. He was destined to greatness because of his relatives. He had very, very well-connected relatives, said Churton. And he had married well, said Churton. And he had been promised greatness, said Churton. Well, I'll leave it to you to decide whether he had married well. He married one of the Lord girls, the eldest of Simeon Lord Jr., granddaughter-in-law of Simeon Lord Sr., ex-convict but big man of influence throughout the colonies. And later on he married into the Darwell family, one of the leading law family of the eastern colonies, we might say. And, he did very well. And ultimately he became, as you might say, chief man of the province. Not premier, but chief man of the province in terms of his profession. And if you say his profession was surveying, he became chief surveyor. Surveyor General of Queensland. And if you go into the Lands Museum, or I don't know whether it's a Lands Museum that holds the photo, whether it's the actual Lands Department, but it has photos on the wall of, great Surveyor Generals, and there is Tully. Let no dog bark. Ha, 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 ha. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. He was a colourless, what will one say? I don't think there was a great sense of importance there, of course. But, very august, that's for sure. But when at the end of his career, the best that could be said of him was that relationships with him had been satisfactory, and he appeared to know what he was doing, and they gave him a travelling clock or something. They weren't shouting to the heavens their admiration of the man. He did, he was in the Masons, of course. Now, the big dog of the English Constitution Masonry in Queensland was none other than Gregory. But Tully was in the Irish Constitution Masons, and he rose to the height, as far as I can determine from Pugh's Almanac, of janitor of his particular lodge. It was Fortitude Valley Lodge, if I recall. Can't remember the number, 379. That's just off the top of my head. Janitor, that didn't mean he, emptied the rubbish bins or anything. I think the janitor in lodge terms was sort of a guard. He stood guard while the secret ceremonies were going on, perhaps while new members were being initiated, to be sure that no malcontents or sticky beaks broke in and revealed the secrets of masonry. But after that, he just seems to have faded out. I've looked for his rise in masonry, but didn't seem to go very far. But he was also, I think he may have begun as, he was chaplain of one of the, maybe of the Fortitude Valley Lodge, Irish Lodge, of course. And so, that was the old religious bit in him again, the chaplain on the convict ship, chaplain to the that particular Irish Constitution Lodge. But it all faded out, and after his wife died, after a couple of years, that's the Lord wife, Tully had, you know, where in Milton, where the brewery is, quite close, quite near the brewery, there used to be, or probably still is, an Anglican theological college there, and it was roughly in that area that Tully had a bit of land, and he used to drive in, no doubt, in a fine trap to, oh, I don't think he would have gone on a horse. He would have gone in a buggy of some kind, probably into, I suppose, George Street. But when his wife died, he sold up there. He even sold the cow. Everything was up for sale, the lot, cow included. And he appears to have moved to Kangaroo Point, where he became a whatever one does in the Church of England, you know, sort of a, I don't know what the Church of England does, but they have committees or something, and lay people take jobs on committees, and anyway, whatever that was what Tully did. But anyway, in these years that we're talking about, in the Mangalore, Charleville struggle, you've got, within the one department, you've got Tully, who in the early part of it, up until 1866, was the Deputy Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands, and from 1866 on, the Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands. And then within that same department, you've got Gregory as the Surveyor General. Tully in an excellent position to white-hand whatever Gregory may have wished to do. But then you've got strange things going on. That's the general background. You know that struggle is going on. Now, you don't see much evidence, but we know that struggle went on. But let's go back to the people of the time. It must have seemed rather strange to them that they heard that a town reserve had been declared at the upper crossing, and maybe because there had been some official recognition of the site, they moved there and they did various things. Well, I don't think a great number of them actually moved there, but a whole range of sort of people who could make a buck out of that general movement of population at that upper crossing would have been hanging around there. There seemed to be a lot of builders on that petition that just made its way to Brisbane in 1866. A lot of builders, but they weren't building anything there at the crossing. They must have been itinerant builders in the district. There was a wheelwright. Well, he could have been working anywhere, I suppose, where he could build a fire and knock out a wheel. And there was also a blacksmith. I don't know whether a blacksmith might have had a bit of a shanty there at the crossing. I don't know. But not a great number. But there were people there, you see, at that time. And they at least claimed to some wish for permanence. Well, as far as we can tell, the only one who actually got permanence there were the Zemans and by accident the Janetskis. But there was no permanence for the others. But nevertheless, let's assume that there were some people round about who had hoped that the town was surveyed and that's where it would be. And why would they doubt that it wouldn't be there? Because they would arrive and they'd say, this has been the site that's surveyed. But not very long down the track, they'd begin hearing stories. And the stories that began to percolate in the 12 months after the town reserve was actually gazetted was that the government was thinking of a rival town down at Mangalore. Road work went on, or planning for roads went on, and eventually even another town was actually gazetted just 20 miles down the river, and there was talk that the town may be moved. Well, you know, if you were a capitalist and you'd set up a shanty at the upper crossing, even if you had shares in the pub, you may have been slightly troubled by this, but nevertheless, this was, and you'd think, well, what on earth is going on? Well, maybe ask what's going on, but the answer is very obvious. Tully goes back to Brisbane and said, I've surveyed the Charleville site, the upper crossing site, and I take it from what I read between the lines of what's written in the period that in that 1864 flood, it must have been known that of all of the sites along the river, they saw, the whole of the river being affected, and all those rivers being affected by the flood of 1864. But I think it must have been known that that site, that upper crossing, Gary Crossing part of the river, must have been spectacularly affected by that particular flood. And so it would not surprise us if the department, hearing from Tully what he had done, thought, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. We know that that site is ridiculous. We know that Tully is incompetent. We know that Tully is lazy. We know that Tully wanted to get back to Brisbane at all possible speed. We also know that, and from what I'll tell you in a moment, we also know that Tully was, well, might we say, insubordinate. Because he was insubordinate, because he knew he could be. He knew he was going to become Deputy Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands. He knew that he had McAllister behind him. And so Gregory, as best he could, knowing the balls up, shall we say, that Tully had made of the job that he was given to do in selecting the upper crossing site at Charleville, decided that, look, we'd better sort this out, and we'll sort it out down the river, where we had intended the town to be, and so on. Now let me move on from there. So that's the general background to it. Now we didn't really have to wait, until 150 years to discover what might have gone on. What was Tully up to? What happened? Why, if we find not very long afterwards that the Surveyor General's Department is desperately trying to get that town going down at Mangalore, why was it that he surveyed Charleville? And so you may wonder, but in fact the answer was given to us, if you believe it, and I do. Now wait until I see if I can find it. Wait a minute, I think it's back here a bit. Just bear with me for a moment. I'm not always as well organised as I should be. I rely upon my memory, and wait a minute, I'll put... Wait a minute, I dare not, because sometimes I press a pause button. Ah, yes. Oh, look, I'm getting more clever. This is continuing on. Sometimes, and I press the wrong button, and we start a new episode. Oh, dear. I'm doing very well. Okay, well now, this fellow Churton wrote lots of letters, but the thing that I find about the letters that Churton wrote is that he seemed to know what was going on in Brisbane. He wasn't one of the Downsmen, and yet he seemed to have the inside knowledge of what was going on. And it would appear, you see, that he had some idea of what was going on with Tully. Writing under the name Will Weasel, he's sometimes Will Weasel, sometimes Churton, and so on, a number of names, okay. But in October of 1864, he wrote, as usual, to the Courier Mail, or not Courier Mail, to the Brisbane Courier, and he, in fact, is describing the arrival of the surveying party. He says, I write to inform you that a posse comitatus containing sundry very ill-looking fellows indeed made their appearance here a few days ago, to the utter disgust of all honest and well-intentioned persons. Well, Tully, Will Weasel, is writing facetiously. He didn't mean this to be unkind. He simply knew that a surveying party had arrived. And by the time he got his news to Brisbane, it was October 1864, so we can assume that Tully arrived out there, probably in early September, late August, early September, something like that. And he was writing, with charity, and writing facetiously, saying that they were ill-looking fellows and so on. Of course, he may not have been so kind had he known what... he may have not been so kind then, had he known what Tully was going to do. Okay then. So that was in October of 1864. Okay then, well, he picked up his Brisbane Courier in February, I think, yes, February of 1865. I opened the pages of the Brisbane Courier only to find news of the gazetting of the site that Tully had chosen. He knew that Tully was there in September of 1864, and maybe he had a fair knowledge of the district, and he may not have known the best site for the capital, but he would certainly have known the worst site, and the worst site was the site that is now occupied by Charleville. So, in February of 1865, Churton opens his copy of the Brisbane Courier, sees where the capital of the Warrego is to be, and subsequently explodes, to the extent that it was prudent to explode. So he wrote a letter to the Courier. I don't think anyone took any notice of the letter except me, all those 150 years later, because you would have thought, what's this man on about? You see, he begins by saying that he writes a letter in the Brisbane Courier of the... it disappeared on the 11th of March, 1865. He quotes a letter from, or an inquiry from Will Weasel, that's himself, who says, somebody asked, tell us the history of this place, Charleville. And somebody had replied and said, maybe Will Weasel replied and said that, well, the history of the town is lost in the mists of time. We know nothing about it. Okay then. Facetious as usual. But then Churton replies. He says, oh, you want to know about Charleville. You want to know the history of Charleville. Oh, he could have said, I can tell you all about that. And he says, not long after the great flood of March 1864, before the waters were completely assuaged and dried from the face of the earth, an officer of the government, whose duty it was to lay out the lines of Charleville, called by some Cholera Town, was met by one of the 40, of whom, or who demanded his business. Tully let this chief of the 40, that is, chief of the 40, he always referred to the Downsmen as the 40 thieves, and he says that Tully was met on the banks of the Warrego by the chief of the 40, who said, piss off, you're not having a town here. This site, Mangalore that he's talking about, of course, this site is not for township purposes. This site is ours, and it's the site upon which he meant for his sheep to pasture upon and his cattle to lie down upon. In other words, he suggests this theatrical scene in which he says, Tully arrived at Mangalore, and this is, he says, where I have to survey a town. The big landowner, the chief of the 40, who was down that way, he doesn't name him, says, piss off. I've got big influence in Brisbane, and you'd be wise to do as I say. And, says Churton, Tully discovered that indeed the man had big influence in Brisbane, and did do as he said, and he did indeed piss off. Where did he piss off to? He pissed off up to Warrego, up to the upper crossing, that upper crossing, Gary Crossing area, where Carter was camped, apparently, Carter the jury recorder. And so anyway, he left, surveyed the area, and because he said he soon found that the 40 were all powerful, well, as indeed they were, even in that distant land, they were powerful even out in the Warrego area. And so if they said jump, you jumped. If they said piss off, you pissed off. And he said that's what happened. Tully was supposed or was going to survey Mangalore, but he was told to piss off. by fellows with strong political influence in the government. And he says, the place that Tully surveyed, he says, the reserve is, in some places, 8 or 9 feet below flood mark. The city itself is built on a ridge of sand on which pine trees grow. And that was it. Well, if you believe that, Churton knew things that we certainly didn't know for 150 years. He suggests that he knew that Tully was supposed to, or was intended by someone, to survey a site for the township at Mangalore. He asserts that even though Tully was supposed to survey the site at Mangalore, according to someone's instructions, he didn't, because he was forbidden to follow those instructions by someone very powerful. Okay then. Well, it would appear, you see, from that, if that's true, if what Churton says is true, when Tully left Brisbane, he left with 2 sets of instructions. He left with one set of instructions from Gregory: go out and survey the capital of the Warrego at this site, Mangalore, because we know that that is a site. Well, I don't even know that they would have been comparing the 2 sites. They wouldn't have even thought of the Charleville site. They would have said, from what we know from local information and from our departmental officers, that's the best place to put the town. And that would have been the instructions that Gregory sent him forth with. But if you have a look, in 1992, a local historian here called Kay Cohen wrote an essay about Augustus Gregory. And in that she says, well, Gregory had a bit of a problem, because the minister was none other than McAllister. And McAllister was a fairly high-handed creature, and he was very much in the habit of issuing, on his own authority and independently of what the departmental heads may have insisted upon, issuing his own instructions. And so if someone, a chief of the 40, had big-time influence in Brisbane, with McAllister, who was the appropriate minister, it's entirely likely that when Gregory moved forth, when Tully rode forth, he rode forth with one set of instructions from Gregory, but he rode forth with another instruction from McAllister. Gregory said, survey at Mangalore. That's your job. McAllister said, survey where you like, but not at Mangalore. And so that's it. Now, whether that's so or not, I'll leave it to you. But we have further evidence along the way. I believe that indeed McAllister did issue contrary instructions. I believe that Gregory did give him a set of instructions to go to Mangalore. And if Tully had gone to Mangalore and surveyed the township there, the whole of Charleville's history, if we'd imagine the town would have been called Charleville, but anyway, the whole of that township's history would have been entirely changed, because if the town had been placed at Mangalore, all that happened after that, all the toing and froing, all of the big boys and their meetings and influential meetings and getting the money and all the rest of it, nothing, that would never have happened. The town would have been there at Mangalore, and that would have been that. But no. It would appear that there was a struggle going on. A struggle going on, first of all, between Tully and Gregory. Tully had surveyed Charleville, the upper site, and he may have felt he might lose a little face if the township were moved. But Gregory, on the other hand, knew that it should be moved. And Gregory and company were proceeding to move the town, if they could, by whatever means, by ongoing planning, down to Mangalore. So that struggle going on between the two of them. But simultaneously, there's a great struggle going on involving, although very quietly, the people at Mangalore, all down the river there, and the people in the upper crossing sorry, in the Upper Warrego area, you're up on the Neve and so on. And I had a look the other day just to see who was at that influential meeting. Wait until I see if I can find where they are. Won't be a moment, I'll get there. Wait a minute, I'm almost there at the big influential meeting. Okay then, now the people at the big influential meeting, oh damn it, I think this particular copy that I've got here doesn't include the attendees at the meeting. Just one moment until I go back to the earlier meeting. It's that one. No, unfortunately. But the impression that I have is that the people at the meeting that finally said, look, give us a 500 and we'll build the road, I think they may have been people from the upper area, may have been up the Neve Yo-Yo area, Gowrie and then out Urella. Well, I call it Urella, but I did see it listed as Urelia the other day. But that may have just been of the moment. But so there were two struggles going on. One lot of landowners from the upper part of the river, I think, who wanted the township closer to them and they didn't care whether there was any flooding at the site that Tully had surveyed. There was a struggle going on there, and they, of course, would have been in league with the Mangalore crew who didn't want it there. And simultaneously, you heard Gregory saying, look, I know where that town was supposed to be, and I'm bloody well going to get it there if I can. And Tully, who had done the dirty on history and on people of Charleville for a long, long time, who by this time, of course, was either the Deputy Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands or the Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands and the Under Secretary of the Department. Well, we know there. So we know then that, okay then. Now, where do we get we get hints early in the piece that something is going on. The business of Charleville was not settled. Tully may have surveyed the site, but people didn't like it, or some people didn't like it anyway. And then we start seeing what's going on. Rumours start moving around. People start hearing, hey, we've built here where the township reserve was gazetted, and yet, is it really going to remain here? Again, our friend Carl Churton in May of 1866 says, is McAllister, notice McAllister given the credit for it, is McAllister going to make another abortion of a township at Mangalore, such as he has caused at Charleville? So what's going on, says he. Although Carl Churton is asking this innocently because he knew the whole background of the whole thing. Okay then. He wrote again in May. Okay then. Okay, but then you see, a few years ago I came upon a cache of letters from the department which deal with this period. And wait until I see if I can find it. We go over here. Down the river at Mangalore, what was his job? He was the storekeeper. And he seemed to be the man with the pen. And he was hearing that, here he is down at Mangalore, and he hears that roads are being planned towards Mangalore. And his employer and all of the landowners said that they didn't want the town there. And so Mr. Hunter is writing letters. Mr. Hunter spends some of his time saying, look, you know, the roads are no good. The track that's been proposed by Barron and company, no good. And there is this problem and that problem. But, you know, if you get a road through to Charleville directly, well, he says, there's no problem. He even claimed that there was water every few miles, every 20 miles or 15 miles or something like that. And he was not beyond throwing a little bit of dirt. He says, I hear, you know, that the main people who are making representations to you to get this town moved down to Mangalore is that fellow Carter, Charles Claudius Carter, in Charleville. Whatever his job, he had been the recording clerk. I think he went on to greater things. And also a Mr. Smith, who I'm told is a partner. Mr. Smith, indeed, that's that Mazza, Mr. Smith, who's hoping that we can get another town at Mangalore so he can start up another pub "Oh," he said, "the skullduggery of these selfish creatures." He said, "If you set up a town and you set up a pub here, every horse thief in town is in the whole district is going to come here." No, 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 no. It's a foolish idea," said Mr. Lockhart Hunter. This is in 1860. Of course, Mr. Lockhart Hunter, he only lived a few more years. He was found dead in the cow yard a few years later. But a fine man, I'm told. But you see, he also said, "And I hear that fellow Carter likes to come down to Mangalore to fish. We've heard that he's caught some fine, what is that great big fish out there? The great codfish, Murray cod, is that what it's called?" He says, "Mr. Carter likes fishing. Mr. Carter has caught some fine cod down there. That's why he wants the town down here. So no, 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 no," he says, forget it. It's not a good idea at all." Okay then. And so he went on about roads and water and all that sort of thing. But the engineer of roads for the district, Mr. Austin, said, "Mr. Hunter is the storekeeper at Mangalore. And so how much weight should you put on his views?" He says, "If his employers object to the new township because it deprives them of the exclusive right to a fine permanent reach of water, which is really urgently required for public purposes, and he sympathises with his employers, his opinions in favour of the old roundabout route and so on, and his advocacy of Charleville is a little suspect maybe." Okay then. So what have we got? The town people are thinking of what's going on. But on the other hand, if we believe Churton, the big boys didn't want the town at Mangalore. They're pulling strings in Brisbane, Mangalore. McAllister was well and truly on side. McAllister was probably issuing the contrary instructions, and he was the protector of Tully, and Tully was his protege. And so when Tully got back to Brisbane and said where he'd surveyed the site, Gregory's teeth must nearly have fallen out. He probably wished to give Tully a good kick in the arse for two reasons. One, that he was obviously incompetent, because even if he had been forbidden to survey Mangalore, he still had the whole of the Warrego to choose from. And what did he choose? He chose the Charleville site, possibly the worst site, the most potentially flooded and badly flooded area on the whole of the Warrego that he could have chosen. He'd been insubordinate. He'd not done what he had been told to do. And not only that, in using his own wit, what did he do? He picked the worst site that could have been. Did he care? No, because he wanted to get back to Brisbane. And you might say, well, how much did he know? What did Tully know? Well, he knew Wilton Castle in Wexford. He knew Trinity College. He knew the Tasmanian Club and the fine table that was there. He knew the exalted life of the Lords in Hobart, or in Tasmania, and possibly Hobart also. He was accustomed to fairly fine life. He didn't know very much about the conditions in Western Queensland. The idea, what he saw when he went out to Queensland, he would never have seen anything like it in all his life. And in terms of understanding rivers and topography and all the rest of it, he would have known nothing much. But even whatever he knew, he didn't want to spend time there. He wanted to get back to Brisbane because, life was good for him. He was on the up and up. Okay, well, so you've got that so far. Well, 150 years later, we come upon some documents. Very interesting documents indeed. They're curious documents because for some reason or another, wait until I see if I can find the actual date of it. I won't be a moment. Or have I passed them? No, I have passed them. Wait until I go back. This is not the smoothest presentation, but that's a problem when I try to work entirely on my memory. Okay. Now, Gregory, let me see. Now, what lot is this? I've came across this case of letters written in 1866, 1867. Here we are. Gregory's got a problem. On the one hand, he's got a town surveyed by either the Chief Deputy Commissioner of Crown Lands, or the Deputy Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands, or the Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands. You know, he can't really come out publicly and say, hey, or even privately and say, hey, the man's incompetent, although that's what he must have thought. But for some reason or another, this is October 1866. Now, by this time, there's a new minister, Bell, I think, from Boona. Kuchin. Anyway, new minister and a new secretary of the department, the under-secretary, none other than Tully himself. But it seems that Bell must have made some inquiries, or people must have been saying, hey, what is going on between Charleville and Mangalore? And he must have made a formal inquiry of, perhaps in innocence, of Gregory. And so Gregory had to give him a reply. So Gregory attempted, not so much to tell the truth, but at least to sort of present some sort of plausible explanation of this fiasco. But of course, if he told the truth had to go through Tully. Gregory writes to the minister through the under-secretary. So Gregory is being asked to comment on the work of Tully the surveyor, who by this time was the under-secretary. So you take what you will of what Gregory says. Okay then. Well, now let me see if I can find the business. According to Gregory, in explanation of the actual sighting, the site at Charleville was this. He said, now this is a letter from the 15th of October 1866. He says, look, it was all a balls up. He said, we decided that we were going to have a capital of the Warrego somewhere. We hadn't decided where, but we sent Tully off, and his job was to survey a site for the capital of Warrego. Like almost of his own choice. But he said a few days after he left, we decided, yes, we're going to have it at Mangalore. And we'd sent Tully off without any specific instructions at all. Believe that, if you will. So he said, we got a rider on a fast horse, probably a fine steed, ride after Tully and tell him, stop. The site we want is Mangalore. It's not own choice. Mangalore is what we want. Well, he said, what bad luck it was. He says, by the time our messenger caught up with Tully, Tully had already arrived at the Warrego, and when the messenger produced the instructions, survey Mangalore, Tully said, piss off. I've already surveyed a site. I'm not doing another one. I don't care whether you want Mangalore or not. I've surveyed this upper crossing site at Charleville, and I'm going back to Brisbane to my mahogany desk. And that was that. He was giving, I won't give the forks, but Tully was giving the forks, according to this. Well, would you believe that a party of surveyors was sent off to establish the capital of Warrego? Anywhere? A man in charge who didn't know anything about the district at all? A man of untested Queensland performance as a surveyor? No. Well, okay then. That's what happened. Tully had surveyed this site. Mangalore he'd been instructed to do because, and Gregory must have known by this, that McAllister put him up to it. But what could he do? He's got McAllister as Premier, he's got Tully as Under-Secretary, and he's in a bad way. He can't do very much at all. But he can quietly continue to get the roads going down. Maybe against all hope. Maybe if he can get the roads going through to there or planned through to there, maybe if he can get a town site survey, and indeed he did. By the time they got this petition of October, I think it was, 1866, by that time a town reserve at Mangalore had already been established, and so on. Well, okay then, so Tully's got a bit of a problem. They did get land sales going on, as you know, in 1867 at Charleville, and they attempted land sales in Mangalore in March, I think it was. Yes, March of 1868. But on the day of the sale, instructions came from someone, call the sale off. Someone didn't want that sale of land at Mangalore to go ahead. Well, we don't know why, we don't know who instructed that. But it's a pretty good guess that McAllister and the Mangalore boys were the ones who got it called off. There was a second sale proposed for August of 1868. That didn't happen either. And finally, by the time the sale did go ahead in 1870, no one turned up. That was the end of Mangalore. Okay then, but we go back to Gregory. Gregory says, he says, I'm in a bit of a bind here. And, wait a minute, yes, so here we are. So Gregory's in a bit of a bind. So what did Gregory do? He did an unusual thing. He said, well, we've got a problem here. We've got one surveyed site, in fact, and shortly we'll have, wait a minute, what month is this? This is October. We've now got 2 surveyed sites. But when he wrote this particular letter, he said, look, I'll tell you what we'll do. We've got a difference of opinion here. We've got the Tully site and we've got the Mangalore site. So he said, let's be sure we have 2 surveyed town reserves and then let the public decide. How does he put it? He says, the engineer of roads, having subsequently selected a site for the crossing 20 miles below Charleville, having subsequently proposed, get out. This decision had been made before Tully even left Brisbane in the first instance in 1864. But he says that Mr. Austin has chosen a site at Mangalore which it appears in other respects is better suited as the principal township site of the district. But what was he to do? He's got Tully and his ego, and he's got the landed gentry down at Mangalore and down the river, including perhaps by this time Mr. Big, of whom you can read. Mr. Big, B-I-G-G-E. He was down the road at Claverton, or shortly to be down the road at Claverton. And he says, under these circumstances it is submitted that the most eligible course will be to survey lands for sale at both town sites, leaving the public to select the locality best adapted to the object they may desire to obtain. In other words, let them choose. Well, it was a pretty unequal struggle. There were people in the background preventing the sale at Mangalore, and the big boys had the influence in Brisbane. They, and particularly the upper, the fellows in the upper part of the river there, Neve, out Warrego, out Gowrie maybe, but up around the Neve, and then even Urella, I don't know why, but nevertheless, he was fighting them, and they had the political influence. And so, with all of that behind them, but with all the support of Austin and the department and Gregory and all the rest of it, nothing came of it. Nothing came of it at all. And so this struggle, political struggle, landed gentry struggle, all the rest of it, and struggle of the times too, of course, Charleville triumphed. The fellows got the money, they built the road directly to Charleville, and that was the end of Mangalore, particularly when that sale fell through in 1870. So that seems to be the guts of the matter. The guts of the matter is that Gregory and Austin and the people in the department, they had planned for the town to be at Mangalore. And if it had gone ahead then, the whole history of Charleville would have been entirely different. But no, the people who were there at Mangalore had the political influence. Tully was well and truly prepared to go along with the political interference went on, and he in that sense had no choice, I suppose. Well, no choice in the sense of if he wanted a career, he had no choice. And so, and if he wanted to help his protector, he had no choice. But he was also a lazy man, he was an incompetent man. And given the fact that, for God's sake, even without Mangalore, there must have been somewhere better than that Charleville site, but he was lazy, he was insubordinate, My language hardly goes to describe it. So that was the background to all. Oh, wait a minute. There's one thing I wanted to mention here. Now, anyway, that's the background to it all, and that's the choice of the matter. That's the... Wait a minute, where did I find it here? There's one important thing. Just one moment. Won't be a moment, because I'm going to undo a little bit of local history here. No. Back a few pages. Look, I've got also... here we are. Now, when I was at school, I can remember so many things, from which classroom I was in. And I was in either the grade 3 classroom or the grade 4 classroom. So it was either Jack Walsh or Henry Schonheimer who told me this, or told us this. But he was, in a sense, as people did and always did, pontificating. And he said Tully had surveyed the streets of Charleville, which he had not done. It was Chester. But he went on to say how clever Tully was. Tully had widened, insisted that the roads of Charleville be widened to accommodate the needs of a turning team. And Tully's been given the credit. Or was then given the credit, and I think I've read it since. What a load of bull. Tully would probably never have seen a team until he saw one out along the road as he rode with a sore bum out to Charleville. And as far as the intricacies of handling a team and turning in a street, Tully would have had no idea, for God's sake. But he's given the credit for being so knowledgeable of the needs of Teamsters that he said, look, we've done a town survey, Chester's, but let's broaden the streets a little bit, because they would have us believe that with Tully's intimate knowledge, he knew the streets needed to be a little wider. But that's not so, because I've got the letter here. If you look on all of those volumes that I've done, volumes 1 to 8, the cover of each of those volumes is the map C1401. Have a look at Burke Street and have a look at the adjustment of this street with just a little bit above that, a widening of that particular street. But this is what Chester, who was responsible for C1401 and the original town block survey, wrote. He wrote this to Gregory. Dear Sir, in accordance with your suggestion, I have altered the plan of allotments in the town reserve of Charleville, thereby giving increased road accommodation, and I beg to enclose a tracing showing the alterations, and so on. The person who looked at the initial draft of Chester's survey plan of Charleville said, hey, I think these roads need to be a little bit wider to accommodate the needs of the Teamsters, was none other than Gregory himself. Gregory wrote to Chester and said, please make the adjustments to your plan. What date was this letter? Okay. Chester, this is written in April 1867. But in other words, the person responsible for the widening of those town roads and ensuring that those roads met the needs of the Teamsters was Gregory, not Tully. Tully wouldn't have had a clue. So anyway, make of that what you will. All of that was tucked away, that letter by... the Churton one is really interesting. I should add a bit more to that. Churton, in the letter, Churton goes on to... He doesn't mention Tully, and he writes in this very strange way. But Churton says, I can tell you who was behind it. He says, Tully didn't survey Mangalore because he was instructed not to. But he was instructed not to by a very important man with good connections. And then he went on to outline the people who lay behind what had gone on. And I couldn't work it out for years and years and years, because it talked about, famous, whoever had done this was famous in the halls of botany, and I'm thinking, well, who are the botanists? Who are the botanists who would have had interest in land? And I could never work it out. I searched everyone to see anyone with a connection with botany. And then a year or so ago, one day I was flicking through a Wikipedia article, and I was having a look at the Lords. And lo and behold, when I read the article in Wikipedia dealing with Simeon Lord Sr., lo and behold, He lived in Banks' house. You'll remember Banks, the botanist. He lived in Banks' house in the suburb of Botany. In other words, the person who lay behind all of this was none other than the, in a sense, Simeon Lord Senior, but no doubt the Lords were somehow or another tied up in this. I followed that line through because Churton states quite clearly the people at the background of all of this were the Lords. I tried to follow, I attempted to follow this through, but I can't find. Maybe Churton knew what he was talking about there. Maybe he was just becoming a bit heretic. But Churton obviously knew the whole of the background of Tully. He knew all of his relatives. He knew the background of the whole thing. And he was digging in the dirt there, well and truly. But I can't find any connection between Simeon Lord Senior. He did not arrive in Queensland until in the 1870s. Then they took up that land out of the Victoria Downs, I think it was, out there, north of Morven, Charleville and so on, and, other things. But I can't connect the Lords with that, and so I discount that because I can't explain it. But maybe there is a connection there, and maybe some of these days someone else can do that. But I can't. I can only attach McAllister to it because McAllister, as far as I can see, was Tully's protector. Now make of that what you will. I make of it what I will, and that is that the problems that Charleville had should never have been. If the town had been where Tully and Austin wanted it to be, everything would have been fine. But no, Tully got involved, the politicians got involved, McAllister was involved, the Upper Warrego people were involved, the fellows down and they were influential fellows down that Mangalore way. But they were always in the shadows. You don't hear much of them. The only one of whom you hear a fair bit is none other than Bradley. Now, Bradley was at Mangalore. But I can't find Bradley at Mangalore until about 1867. He may have been there a little bit earlier. And but nevertheless, I can see, he's definitely named Bradley Mangalore in 1869, but he was obviously well established there. But Bradley did all he could from Mangalore to promote Charleville. He did nothing to attract the town to Mangalore, but if he could do anything to promote the well-being of Charleville at a distance, he did. Keep that town at a distance. We don't want it at Mangalore. And there was no finer promoter of Charleville at its current site or its permanent site than Bradley himself. They were the ones who took over the pub, or one of the Bradley, either senior or junior, took over the licence of the pub after the Janetskis decided to leave, sick of it all, in 1869. So there we are. Make of it what you will.